Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The small settlement of Hollow Creek sat nestled between the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee, a place that appeared on few maps even in 1871. The main road leading through the dense forest was little more than a dirt path, rutted by wagon wheels and bordered by ancient oak trees that seemed to lean inward, as if listening to the travelers who passed beneath. It was along this road that the Widow's Inn stood, a two-story structure of weathered timber and stone that had witnessed the passage of countless strangers over the decades. According to county records from Bedford County, the establishment was officially registered as Langley Boarding House, though locals referred to it only as the Widow's Inn. The property consisted of the main building, a modest stable for horses, and approximately 3 acres of cleared land surrounded by dense woodland. The nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, and the closest town of any significance was Shelbyville, some 15 miles southwest. The architecture of the inn itself was typical of structures built in the 1830s in that region of Tennessee. Tax assessments from 1860 describe it as a 2-story timber frame dwelling with stone foundation, comprising 8 rooms for lodging, a common dining area, kitchen, and proprietor's quarters. An addition had been constructed around 1855, according to the same records, extending the eastern wing to accommodate 2 more guest rooms and a larger dining space. The proprietress, Martha Langley, had operated the establishment since 1859, following the death of her husband, Jeremiah Langley. Documents indicate she was approximately 48 years old in 1871, though her exact age was inconsistently recorded in various documents. County birth records suggest she was born Martha Blackwood in 1823 in neighboring Rutherford County, the daughter of a blacksmith. She married Jeremiah Langley in 1841, according to church records from the Methodist congregation in Shelbyville. What is known with certainty is that the widow maintained the inn with the assistance of a man named Silas Thornton, described in tax records as a hired hand, who had worked at the property for nearly 7 years. Thornton, approximately 40 years of age in 1871, was something of a mystery to locals. Various accounts describe him as having arrived in the area around 1864, during the final year of the Civil War. Some suggested he was a deserter, though from which army remained unclear. Others believed he had been a prisoner of war who had escaped during transport. Whatever his origins, Thornton kept largely to himself, making infrequent trips to Shelbyville for supplies and otherwise remaining at the inn. The establishment had earned a reputation for reliability among travelers on the Nashville-Knoxville route. Commercial records from various Nashville businesses include receipts for accommodations at Langley's Inn or the Widow's Place, suggesting it was a known stopping point for merchants and salesmen. The rates were described as fair in a Nashville businessman's ledger from 1870, with notations praising the substantial meals and adequate, if plain, accommodations. It was on April 17, 1871, that the first documented irregularity occurred. A merchant from Nashville named Thomas Green arrived in Shelbyville inquiring about a business associate, William Harrington, who had departed Nashville 2 weeks prior with the intention of securing timber contracts in the region. According to Green's written statement preserved in county records, Harrington had written to him confirming his stay at a widow's boarding house near Hollow Creek and his intention to return to Nashville within 3 days. 2 weeks had passed with no word. Green's statement describes Harrington as a methodical man of 52 years, with graying hair and a prominent scar on his right cheek from a childhood accident. He had been in the timber business for over 20 years and was known for his reliability. His letter to Green, dated April 2nd, mentioned his intention to assess the quality of oak and hickory in the forests surrounding Hollow Creek, with particular interest in securing lumber for furniture manufacturing. The local sheriff, Josiah Miller, accompanied Green to the widow's inn. Martha Langley received them cordially, offering coffee while they discussed the missing man. According to Sheriff Miller's report, the widow claimed Harrington had indeed stayed for one night, but had departed early the following morning, heading eastward. When asked about the registry book that all legitimate establishments were required to maintain, Langley explained that it had been damaged when a roof leak soaked several pages, and she had not yet replaced it. Sheriff Miller noted in his report that while the explanation seemed reasonable, something about the widow's demeanor left him uneasy. She maintained eye contact in a manner uncommon for women of her station, he wrote, and spoke with a certainty that bordered on rehearsed. Nevertheless, with no evidence of wrongdoing and Harrington's horse and belongings absent, the sheriff could do little but file a report of a missing person. Green returned to Nashville without his associate or any contracts. A notice regarding Harrington's disappearance appeared in the Nashville Clarion on April 25, 1871, requesting information from anyone who might have encountered him. No responses were recorded. What might have remained an isolated incident began to form a pattern when, in June of that same year, another visitor to Shelbyville inquired about a missing person. James Thornbury, a cattle buyer from Kentucky, had not returned home as scheduled. His last known location, according to correspondence found among his effects, was the widow's inn, where he had written he would stay for a night or two at most before concluding his business. Thornbury's brother, Robert, provided a detailed account of James's business in the region. He had traveled to Tennessee to purchase cattle for transport to Kentucky meatpacking facilities, carrying with him approximately $1,200 in banknotes and gold coins. His letter home, dated June 1st, mentioned securing the purchase of 23 head of prime beef cattle from a farmer near Shelbyville, with the intention of finalizing the transaction the following day. Again, Sheriff Miller rode to the inn. This time his report indicates a more thorough inspection of the premises, though no search warrant was officially issued. Martha Langley again confirmed the visitor had stayed but departed, this time heading north toward Kentucky. She produced a newly acquired registry book, showing Thornbury's signature and date of departure as June 4th. The signature appeared genuine when compared to other documents bearing Thornbury's hand. The sheriff's report notes that he inspected the stables and questioned Silas Thornton separately from the widow. Thornton corroborated his employer's account, adding that he had helped the cattle buyer saddle his horse before dawn. When asked why a man would depart so early, Thornton explained that Thornbury had expressed concern about driving the cattle during the heat of the day. Miller noted that no cattle had been reported moving through the area in recent days, an observation that Thornton attributed to the buyer likely taking a different route north. The explanation was plausible, as several roads connected the region to Kentucky. Without evidence of foul play, Miller could again only file a report and advise Robert Thornbury to continue his inquiries elsewhere. What happened next would remain undocumented for nearly 80 years, until the discovery of Sheriff Miller's personal journal during a 1949 renovation of what had once been his home in Shelbyville. The journal, now preserved in the Tennessee State Archives, reveals that Miller returned to the inn alone 3 days after his official visit, arriving near dusk. "I concealed my horse some distance from the property and approached on foot," Miller wrote. "My intention was not to make an official call, but to observe the establishment from the woods adjacent to the clearing. For 3 hours I watched as lamps were lit and extinguished in various rooms. Twice I observed the hired man, Thornton, carrying large bundles from the stable to the root cellar behind the main house. The bundles appeared heavy and were wrapped in what looked to be canvas or burlap. At approximately 10 o'clock I witnessed the arrival of a traveler on horseback. A man appearing to be in his 30s dismounted and approached the main entrance. The widow greeted him at the door, and after a brief exchange, the man entered while Thornton took charge of his horse. I remained until well after midnight, by which time all lamps had been extinguished. I returned before dawn and observed no unusual activity. The traveler's horse remained in the stable. I departed before I might be discovered, resolving to return the following evening. However, upon my return to town, I received word of a disturbance requiring my immediate attention, and several days passed before I could resume my unofficial investigation. The disturbance Miller referenced was documented in the Shelbyville Gazette as a confrontation between former Confederate and Union soldiers at a local establishment, resulting in 1 death and 3 injuries. Such incidents remained common in the years following the war, and as the county's principal law enforcement officer, Miller's attention was required for several days. Miller's journal indicates he returned 5 days later, only to find no sign of the traveler or his horse. When he made an official call the following day, under the pretense of following up on the previous missing persons cases, Martha Langley made no mention of a recent guest. The registry book showed no new entries since Thornbury's departure. "I inquired casually about business," Miller wrote, to which the widow replied it had been slow, with no guests in nearly 2 weeks. This contradicted my observations entirely, yet I maintained an appearance of disinterest. I noted that the widow appeared more prosperous than one might expect for an establishment with so little custom. Her dress was of good quality fabric, and a new piece of furniture, a walnut secretary desk, stood in the front parlor where none had been before. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1871, Sheriff Miller documented his growing suspicion. County tax records from this period show that while most establishments in the region struggled financially in the years following the Civil War, the Widow's Inn appeared surprisingly solvent, with all taxes paid promptly and in full. Yet travelers' accounts collected by Miller suggested the inn rarely hosted more than 1 or 2 guests per week. Miller began to make discreet inquiries among merchants in Shelbyville regarding the widow's purchases. A dressmaker confirmed that Martha Langley had commissioned 2 new dresses in the past 6 months, paying in cash. The owner of the general store reported regular purchases of coffee, sugar, and other staples in quantities that seemed excessive for an establishment with few guests. Most notably, a jeweler recalled purchasing several pocket watches and a gold wedding band from Silas Thornton, who claimed the items had belonged to his late uncle. The sheriff's journal entries become increasingly preoccupied with the inn and its proprietress. "There is a coldness about the widow that I cannot reconcile with her outward cordiality," he wrote in September. "Her eyes never smile, regardless of her lips. The man Thornton speaks little and observes much. I am convinced they harbor secrets, yet I have no evidence that would justify a formal investigation." In October 1871, Miller documented his conversation with an elderly resident of Hollow Creek, a woman named Abigail Winters, who claimed to have known Jeremiah Langley before his death. "He was a cruel man," Miller recorded her saying, "with a temper that could curdle milk. Folk hereabouts weren't surprised when he died so sudden. Some thought the widow might have had a hand in it, though nothing was ever proven. They say he beat her something terrible." Winters, approximately 70 years old in 1871, had lived in the area her entire life. Her account of Jeremiah Langley described him as a man of considerable appetites and little restraint, who had been known to frequent establishments of ill repute in Shelbyville despite his marriage. She recalled an incident in 1857 when Martha Langley had appeared at church with bruises visible on her face and neck, which she had attributed to a fall. Jeremiah Langley's death certificate, located in county records, states the cause as apoplexy, a term commonly used for strokes or sudden cardiac events. No investigation was conducted at the time. The document was signed by a doctor from Shelbyville who, records indicate, arrived at the inn nearly 2 days after the death occurred. The circumstances surrounding Jeremiah's death, as recounted by Abigail Winters, involved a sudden collapse during the evening meal. Martha had reportedly attempted to summon help, but the isolated location of the inn meant considerable time passed before a neighbor could be located and sent for the doctor. By the time medical assistance arrived, Jeremiah had been dead for many hours. The doctor, noting no obvious signs of foul play and recognizing the symptoms described as consistent with apoplexy, certified the death without further inquiry. An intriguing detail emerged from church records examined by Miller. The pastor of the Methodist congregation in Shelbyville had noted in his personal records that Martha Langley had ceased attending services approximately 6 months before her husband's death, only to resume regular attendance within weeks of becoming a widow. The pastor attributed this to Jeremiah's alleged prohibition against his wife's religious activities, though this was never confirmed. By November, Sheriff Miller's journal reveals he had begun interviewing travelers who had stayed at the inn and departed without incident. One account in particular, from a drummer named Frederick Simmons, caught his attention. Simmons described waking in the night to the sound of movement in the adjacent room. "Through the thin wall," Miller recorded Simmons saying, "I heard what sounded like furniture being moved, followed by a scraping sound from the floor. Later, I was certain I heard voices from beneath, as if coming through the floorboards. When I inquired of the widow at breakfast, she explained that Thornton often worked late in the root cellar, preparing preserves and storing supplies. Simmons, a seller of patent medicines who traveled the region regularly, had stayed at the inn on 3 separate occasions. He described Martha Langley as attentive to a fault, noting that she had seemed particularly interested in his itinerary and the contents of his sample case. He recalled that during his most recent stay, in October 1871, he had declined Langley's offer of a particular room, the one at the end of the upstairs hallway, expressing preference for one closer to the stairs due to a troublesome knee. "She seemed momentarily disconcerted by my request," Simmons told Miller, "though she recovered quickly and accommodated me with another room." Another guest, a livestock trader named Ephraim Collins, reported a similar experience with room assignments. He described how the widow had initially directed him to the room at the hall's end, only to change her mind when he mentioned his intention to depart before dawn. "She insisted I take a room on the ground floor instead," Collins stated, explaining it would allow me to leave without disturbing other guests. "I thought it considerate at the time, though in retrospect, her insistence was curious." The most significant development in Miller's unofficial investigation came on December 3, 1871. His journal describes how a severe winter storm forced him to seek shelter at the inn while returning from serving papers in a distant part of the county. "For the first time, I found myself a guest in the establishment that had occupied my thoughts for so many months," he wrote. The widow showed no surprise at my arrival, despite the lateness of the hour and the unexpectedness of my visit. "I was given a room on the second floor at the end of the hallway. The room," Miller noted, "was simply furnished but comfortable, with a bed, washstand, small writing desk, and chair. A rag rug covered a portion of the wooden floor, and heavy curtains framed the single window that overlooked the rear of the property. A small fireplace provided heat, with a fire already burning when Miller was shown to the room. The widow was most insistent that I should be comfortable," Miller wrote. "She brought extra blankets, though I had not requested them, and lingered in the doorway as if reluctant to leave. She mentioned that no other guests were present, which I found curious, given the weather conditions that had forced me to seek accommodation. One might expect other travelers to have done the same." Miller's detailed account of his stay describes a restless night, during which he conducted a careful examination of his room. "The furniture is of good quality, though aged. The bed frame and washstand appear original to the house, which I estimate to be at least 30 years old. The floorboards, however, drew my particular attention. In the corner farthest from the door, I observed that several boards appeared newer than the rest, with less wear and slightly different coloring. Additionally, the nails securing them seemed more recent manufacture than would be consistent with the original construction." After ensuring his door was securely locked, Miller described removing the rug to examine the floorboards more closely. "Using the blade of my pocket knife, I attempted to probe the seams between boards. To my surprise, one section, approximately 3 feet square, seemed to have been cut and replaced as a unit. The boards were secured too tightly for my knife to gain purchase, and without proper tools, I could not investigate further without risking detection." Throughout the night, Miller documented hearing irregular thuds from somewhere below, which he initially attributed to Thornton moving about the first floor. However, he noted that the sounds did not seem to come from directly below his room, which was positioned above the kitchen, but rather from deeper, as if from beneath the house itself. At one point, he distinctly heard the scrape of metal against stone, followed by what sounded like liquid being poured. I placed my ear to the floor near the replaced section, Miller wrote, and detected what I can only describe as murmured conversation, though I could distinguish no words. A chill ran through me at the realization that someone was awake and active in what must be a space beneath the house proper, accessible through the very floor on which I stood. In the morning, Miller described Martha Langley as unusually solicitous, insisting he remain for breakfast despite his stated intention to depart early. During the meal, he observed that Thornton was absent, having allegedly departed before dawn to check trap lines in the surrounding woods. The widow served a hearty breakfast of ham, eggs, and biscuits with gravy, Miller noted. The quality of the meat was exceptional, and I commented on it, to which she replied that they slaughtered their own hogs and prepared the meat according to a family recipe. She pressed me to take a second helping with such insistence that I complied, though my appetite had been diminished by the suspicions that had grown throughout the night. Before leaving, Miller managed a brief exploration of the grounds, noting the location of the root cellar, which was accessed via a slanted door at the rear of the property. The door was secured with a heavy padlock. Near the cellar entrance, he observed a curious dark stain on the snow, approximately 2 feet in diameter, which appeared recent. The coloration suggested something other than mud or animal blood, though I could not be certain in the morning light. Miller also documented a small outbuilding behind the stable, which Thornton had previously identified as a smokehouse. The structure appeared well maintained, he wrote, with a substantial stone foundation extending several feet into the ground, unusual for a building of its purpose. Smoke rose from a chimney indicating recent use, which aligned with the widow's claim of preparing their own meats. The sheriff's journal indicates his intention to return with a warrant, though he acknowledged the challenge of obtaining one based on his observations alone. "I have nothing beyond suspicion and circumstance," he wrote. "No bodies, no witnesses to any crime, only a pattern of disappearances and my own misgivings." Upon returning to Shelbyville, Miller confided his suspicions to his deputy, a young man named Ezekiel Parker. Parker's statement, recorded in 1952 during the subsequent investigation, recalls the sheriff's demeanor. He was troubled like I'd never seen him. Said something wasn't right at the widow's place, that folks were going in but not coming out. He mentioned sounds under the floor and new boards where old ones should be. I thought perhaps the strain of office was affecting his judgment, especially with all the troubles following the war. Miller's journal entries for the following week detail his efforts to build a case. He sent telegrams to authorities in Nashville and Kentucky requesting information about Harrington and Thornbury. He revisited financial records, noting the incongruity between the inn's apparent prosperity and its reported business. Most significantly, he began investigating the background of Silas Thornton. No record exists of Thornton's presence in the county prior to 1864, Miller wrote. He appeared suddenly, as many did during the war's chaos, but unlike most, he offered no account of his origins or previous occupation. The widow claimed he was a distant relation of her late husband, yet Jeremiah's family Bible, which I examined at the Methodist Church, where it was donated after his death, contains no mention of any Thornton connection. Miller's inquiries led him to a disturbing discovery. A newspaper clipping from the Louisville Courier, dated 1862, described the escape of a prisoner from a Kentucky jail where he had been awaiting trial for the murder of a family in rural Jefferson County. The prisoner, identified as Samuel Thompson, had allegedly killed a farmer, his wife, and their hired hand during a robbery before being captured, attempting to sell the victim's possessions in Louisville. The description of Thompson, a man of medium height with a distinctive limp and a scar running from his left ear to jawline, bore striking similarities to Silas Thornton. "I cannot be certain they are the same man," Miller noted, "yet the coincidence is troubling. Thornton indeed walks with a slight irregularity in his gait, and though he wears a beard that might conceal such a scar, I have observed that he never exposes the left side of his face when shaving, as reported by the barber in Shelbyville. What happened next is documented not in Miller's journal, but in the official county records. On December 18, 1871, a fire was reported at the widow's inn. By the time neighbors and townspeople arrived, the main structure had largely collapsed, with only the stone chimney and foundation remaining intact. The bodies of Martha Langley and Silas Thornton were discovered in the ruins, apparently overcome by smoke while sleeping. The official report, filed by Sheriff Miller's deputy due to the sheriff's absence, concluded that the fire likely originated from an overturned oil lamp or fireplace ember. Property records indicate the land was eventually sold for taxes, though no new structure was ever built on the site. For nearly 80 years, the story of the widow's inn remained largely forgotten, surviving only in local folklore and the occasional tale of travelers who disappeared on the road through Hollow Creek. It was not until 1949, when Sheriff Miller's journal was discovered, that interest in the case revived. The journal's final entries, dated December 15 to 17, 1871, reveal that Miller had continued his investigation and made a disturbing discovery. After interviewing a blacksmith in Shelbyville who claimed to have shoed horses for the widow on several occasions, Miller learned that Thornton regularly brought items to sell, items that appeared to have belonged to travelers, pocket watches, cufflinks, even a distinctive ring that the blacksmith recognized as similar to one worn by the missing cattle buyer. Thornberry. The blacksmith, Isaiah Hammond, provided a signed statement that was included in Miller's official records. Thornton would come maybe once a month, Hammond stated, always with something to trade or sell. Said they were items left behind by guests who couldn't pay their bills, but some were mighty fine pieces for folks who couldn't settle a night's lodging. One time he brought in a gold watch with an inscription, something about faithful service to a company in Nashville. I offered him $15 for it, which he took without haggling. Miller's investigation also led him to interview a former domestic servant who had briefly worked at the inn in 1867. Mary Perkins, then a young woman of 20, had been employed for approximately 3 months before leaving abruptly. Her account, as recorded in Miller's journal, described strange behaviors she had observed. The widow would not allow me into certain areas of the house, Perkins told Miller. The root cellar was strictly forbidden, as was a locked room off the kitchen. Thornton came and went at odd hours, and I often heard them conversing in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. Once I observed Thornton carrying what appeared to be bloodied clothing to the wash-house, though the widow claimed they had slaughtered a pig that morning. I saw no evidence of such butchery. Perkins further recalled being instructed to prepare rooms for guests who, according to the widow, would arrive later in the evening. She was particular about which rooms were to be made ready, Perkins stated. Always the one at the end of the hall upstairs, or occasionally the corner room on the ground floor. She would send me home early on those evenings, insisting she would attend to the guests herself. The most troubling aspect of Perkins's account involved a discovery she made shortly before leaving her position. I was sweeping the upstairs hallway when I noticed a small object glinting near the floorboard, she told Miller. It was a man's gold collar stud, engraved with the initials W.M. When I brought it to the widow, thinking it belonged to a guest, her expression changed in a way that frightened me. She snatched it from my hand and accused me of snooping where I shouldn't. The next day, she informed me my services were no longer required. Miller's last entry, dated December 17th, states his intention to return to the inn the following day with a warrant and several deputies. I can no longer ignore my suspicions, he wrote. Too many travelers have vanished after staying at the widow's inn. I believe the answers lie beneath the structure, in spaces accessed through the replaced floorboards I observed during my stay. Tomorrow we shall know the truth. Sheriff Miller never returned to town. County records indicate a search party was formed on December 20th, after the fire and the discovery that Miller had not been seen since departing Shelbyville on the morning of December 18th. His horse was eventually found wandering near the Bedford County line, but no trace of the sheriff was ever discovered. Deputy Parker's subsequent report notes that Miller had obtained a search warrant from Judge Hiram Collier late on December 17. The judge later confirmed issuing the warrant based on Miller's evidence regarding the suspicious activities at the inn and the possible connection between Silas Thornton and the fugitive Samuel Thompson. According to Parker's statement, Miller had intended to gather a party of deputies and concerned citizens to execute the warrant. He wanted sufficient manpower to ensure there would be no resistance, Parker recalled. Yet on the morning of the 18th, he departed alone, saying he would first conduct a final reconnaissance of the property before returning for the rest of us. That was the last anyone saw of him, the timing of the fire occurring on the very day Miller planned to execute. His search warrant raised questions that were never officially addressed in the immediate aftermath. The investigation into the fire was cursory at best, with the deputy's report concluding that all evidence indicates an accidental ignition of common origin, with no suggestion of malicious intent. This conclusion went unchallenged for decades. The case might have remained closed were it not for a discovery made in 1952 during a highway expansion project that passed near the former site of the Widow's Inn. Construction workers excavating the area uncovered a series of underground chambers extending from what had once been the inn's root cellar. Tennessee State Archaeological Services was called to investigate what was initially believed to be a pre-Civil War root cellar system. What they found instead, according to the official report filed on June 8, 1952, was evidence of something far more sinister. The underground space consisted of 3 chambers roughly hewn from the earth and reinforced with timber supports. The largest chamber contained the remains of what appeared to be a workshop, with tools for leather working and metal smithing. The second chamber held 6 trunks containing personal effects, clothing, documents, jewelry, and other items belonging to at least 9 different individuals, based on monogrammed items and inscribed possessions. The archaeological report details the contents meticulously. One trunk contained 3 suits of men's clothing of varying sizes, all of good quality. Another held personal correspondence, business papers, and several wallets containing identification for different individuals. A third trunk was filled with jewelry, watches, and other valuables, many bearing inscriptions or monograms. A leather folio contained deeds, contracts, and banknotes totaling over $3,000, a considerable sum in the 1870s. Most telling was a ledger found among Martha Langley's possessions. While water damage and time had rendered portions illegible, enough remained to reveal a disturbing pattern. The ledger contained entries spanning from 1860 to 1871, with columns for dates, descriptions, and values. Many entries referenced goods acquired, followed by notations such as gold timepiece, $12, or wallet contents, $34.25. Some entries included initials that corresponded to items found in the trunks. The third and smallest chamber contained human remains. According to the archaeological report, portions of at least 12 adult male skeletons were recovered, though the condition of the remains made precise identification difficult. Forensic examination, limited by the technology of the time, determined that most of the remains showed evidence of trauma consistent with blunt force to the skull. Several exhibited cut marks on the long bones that experts concluded were consistent with the removal of flesh. Dr. Elias Montgomery, the forensic examiner assigned to the case, noted in his report that the remains had been processed in a systematic manner, suggesting familiarity with butchery techniques. Certain bones showed evidence of having been subjected to heat, while others appeared to have been deliberately broken to extract marrow. Among the remains, investigators discovered a badge belonging to the Bedford County Sheriff's Office and a pocket watch bearing the inscription, "To Josiah. With gratitude for your service, Bedford County Board of Supervisors, 1865. These items were positively identified as having belonged to Sheriff Josiah Miller. The investigation concluded that Martha Langley and Silas Thornton had operated the inn as a deadly trap for travelers for at least 12 years, murdering guests for their valuables and disposing of their remains in the hidden chambers beneath the property. The elaborate underground structure suggested significant effort and planning, indicating the operation was far from opportunistic. Construction records from the county archives indicate that substantial modifications were made to the property in 1860, shortly after Jeremiah Langley's death. A builder from Shelbyville was commissioned to expand the root cellar and reinforce the foundation, with the work taking nearly 3 months to complete. The timing suggests that Martha may have begun planning her crimes almost immediately after becoming a widow, though whether Silas Thornton was involved from the beginning remains unclear. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence found in the workshop chamber. Detailed notebooks, partially damaged but still legible, contained what appeared to be recipes and instructions for the preparation of meat, alongside inventories of personal items taken from victims. The implications were clear and horrifying. The widow and her accomplice had not only murdered their guests, but had processed the remains for consumption. One notebook, identified by handwriting analysis as belonging to Martha Langley, contained entries such as, "The younger ones provide the most tender cuts. The shoulder and upper thigh particularly good for roasting. Older subjects tougher but suitable for stewing with ample time." Another entry noted, "Preserving method improved with addition of more salt and hickory smoke. Winter stores should last until April if properly maintained." Further investigation revealed that Martha Langley regularly supplied meat pies and preserved goods to several families in the Hollow Creek area, as well as occasionally to merchants in Shelbyville. There is no evidence that anyone who consumed these goods was aware of their true nature. The widow's preserved meats had, in fact, earned a reputation for their quality, with one merchant in Shelbyville noting in his records that Mrs. Langley's ham and sausages command a premium price for their exceptional flavor. The case was officially closed in 1953, with the conclusion that the perpetrators had died in the 1871 fire. The remains recovered from the chambers were interred in a common grave in the Shelbyville Cemetery, marked only with the years of discovery and a simple inscription, "Wanderers at Rest." Questions remain about the fire that destroyed the inn. While officially ruled accidental, Sheriff Miller's journal and the timing of the blaze, on the very day he planned to execute a search warrant, have led some historians to speculate that the fire may have been deliberately set by Langley and Thornton, perhaps after discovering Miller's intentions. Others suggest that Miller himself may have set the fire, either deliberately or during a confrontation, becoming another victim in the process. Dr. Montgomery's analysis of the remains found in the chambers indicated that at least some of the victims had died within days or weeks of the fire, suggesting that the widow and Thornton had continued their activities until the very end. One set of remains, believed to be Sheriff Miller, based on height and age estimations, showed signs of a struggle with defensive fractures to the bones of the forearm and a crushed larynx. Local folklore surrounding the former site of the widow's inn persisted for decades. Residents reported hearing strange sounds from the woods at night, metallic clanking, and what some described as the sound of a woman humming. By the 1960s, the land had been completely absorbed by the new highway and surrounding development, erasing any physical reminder of what had once stood there. The case of the Widow's Inn represents one of the earliest documented instances of serial murder in Tennessee history, predating more famous cases by decades. The methodical nature of the killings, the elaborately constructed underground chambers, and the apparent cannibalistic practices of the perpetrators make it particularly noteworthy. Yet it remains relatively unknown outside academic and true crime circles. Psychological analysis conducted in the 1960s by Dr. Margaret Holbrook of Vanderbilt University suggested that Martha Langley may have developed her murderous tendencies as a response to years of abuse at the hands of her husband. The pattern of selecting male victims exclusively, Dr. Holbrook wrote in her study of historical criminal cases, suggests a displacement of rage from her abusive spouse to men who resembled him in some capacity, perhaps travelers who demonstrated the same sense of entitlement or authority that characterized her husband, the relationship between Langley and Thornton remains a subject of speculation. Some evidence suggests they may have been more than employer and employee. A statement from Mary Perkins, the former servant, described them as familiar in a way that exceeded propriety, though they maintained separate quarters. Whether Thornton was a willing participant from the beginning or was drawn into Langley's schemes through manipulation remains unclear. What motivated Martha Langley and Silas Thornton may never be fully understood. Some researchers point to the trauma Martha likely experienced at the hands of her abusive husband, while others note the financial benefits the pair derived from their crimes during the economically challenging post-Civil War period. Whatever their reasons, the legacy of the Widow's Inn serves as a dark reminder of the dangers that once lurked along the isolated roads of rural Tennessee. In 1968, during an interview conducted for the Tennessee Historical Society's Oral History Project, an elderly resident of Bedford County who claimed to have known Martha Langley in his youth offered perhaps the most chilling perspective on the case. "She wasn't right in the head," he stated, "but she could look you in the eye and make you feel like you was the only person in the world worth talking to. That's how she got 'em, I reckon. Made 'em feel special, right up until she didn't need 'em to feel anything at all." The resident, identified as Thomas Blackburn, would have been a young boy during the period in question. His account describes Martha Langley as a handsome woman, not beautiful exactly, but striking. He recalled his father's warnings never to approach the inn alone and to stay on the main roads when traveling in that area. "There was talk even before the sheriff went missing," Blackburn stated. "Folks just didn't have proof of anything, and in those days, without proof, you kept your suspicions to yourself." A curious footnote to the case emerged in 1965, when a historian researching Civil War era records discovered a military report from 1863 describing the apprehension of a Confederate deserter near what would later become the site of the Widow's Inn. The deserter, who was not named in the report, had allegedly been living in a crude dugout in the woods, surviving by ambushing solitary travelers and stealing their provisions. The report mentioned finding human bones and personal effects in the dugout, suggesting the deserter had murdered at least 3 victims. The military records indicate the deserter escaped custody during transport and was never recaptured. Some researchers have speculated that this individual may have been Silas Thornton, who appeared in the area the following year. If true, it would suggest that Thornton brought his murderous tendencies to the partnership with Martha Langley, perhaps finding in her a kindred spirit or willing accomplice. Archaeological examination of the underground chambers revealed construction techniques consistent with military field engineering, particularly the reinforcement of the earthen walls and the ventilation system that prevented detection of smoke or odors from the surface. Such knowledge would have been common among soldiers of both armies during the Civil War, lending credence to the theory that Thornton had military experience. The question of how many victims fell prey to the widow and her accomplice remains unanswered. The 12 sets of remains discovered in 1952 likely represent only a portion of the total, as the journals and ledgers suggest a much higher count. Entries in Martha Langley's ledger span more than a decade, with regular notations of acquisitions that correspond to missing travelers. Conservative estimates place the number of victims at between 20 and 30, making the Widow's Inn one of the most prolific killing sites in American history up to that time. The scope of the crimes becomes more apparent when considering the strategic location of the inn. Situated on a secondary road between Nashville and Knoxville, it attracted travelers seeking to avoid the more heavily trafficked main routes. The post-Civil War period saw significant movement of people throughout the region, with merchants, land speculators, and displaced families traversing the back roads of Tennessee. Many traveled alone or in small groups, carrying whatever valuables they possessed, making them ideal targets. The widow appears to have been selective in choosing her victims. The remains and personal effects recovered from the chambers suggest the targets were exclusively adult males, typically those traveling alone and likely to have money or valuables. This selection process indicates a level of calculation that contradicts any notion that the killings were random or opportunistic. Martha's method of operation, as reconstructed from various accounts and physical evidence, followed a pattern. Guests would be welcomed warmly, fed well, and assigned to specific rooms, either the one at the end of the upstairs hall or the corner room on the ground floor. Both locations were later found to have modified floorboards that could be removed to access the chambers below. The victims were likely killed in their sleep, with evidence suggesting blunt force trauma as the primary method. Silas Thornton's role appears to have been primarily as an accomplice in the disposal of bodies and the processing of remains, as well as the selling of valuables in distant locations to avoid suspicion. His background, possibly as a fugitive murderer from Kentucky and later as a deserter who preyed on travelers, suggests he brought his own criminal expertise to the partnership. The chambers discovered in 1952 were eventually filled in and paved over during subsequent highway expansions. Today, thousands of vehicles pass over the site daily, their occupants unaware of what lies beneath the asphalt. The final secret of the Widow's Inn, where guests checked in but never checked out. The story of the Widow's Inn has inspired numerous fictional accounts, from novels to stage plays, though most embellish the already gruesome facts with supernatural elements entirely absent from the historical record. The reality, as documented in county archives, archaeological reports, and Sheriff Miller's journal, requires no such embellishment to disturb. One of the most comprehensive analyses of the case was conducted in 1957 by criminologist Dr. Howard Finley, who compared the methods and motivations of the Widow's Inn killers to other historical cases of multiple murder. What distinguishes this case, Dr. Finley wrote, is the apparent domesticity surrounding the crimes. The victims were not simply killed and robbed. They were processed as one might process livestock, with their remains treated as a commodity. This suggests a level of detachment and rationalization rarely seen, even in the most hardened killers. Finley noted the parallel between the widow's legitimate business, providing food and shelter to travelers, and her criminal enterprise. The line between host and predator became blurred, he observed. To Martha Langley, her guests represented both a source of income through their patronage and a resource to be harvested. This duality may have allowed her to normalize behavior that would otherwise be recognized as monstrous. The psychological impact of the case on the surrounding community was profound and lasting. For decades after the discoveries of 1952, residents of Bedford County reported uneasiness about eating in unfamiliar establishments or accepting food from strangers. Local folklore began to include warnings about the widow's recipe as a caution against trusting too readily. Those traveling the back roads of eastern Tennessee today will find no marker, no memorial to those who disappeared. The forest has reclaimed much of the land surrounding the old road, and Hollow Creek itself has dwindled to little more than a name on old maps. But in the collective memory of the region, preserved in journals, archaeological reports, and the whispered stories passed down through generations, the Widow's Inn remains, a dark chapter in Tennessee's history that reminds us how easily travelers could vanish in a time when communication was limited and trust was given more freely than perhaps it should have been. The final word on the case might belong to Judge Hiram Collier, who issued the search warrant that Sheriff Miller never had the chance to execute. In a letter to his son, discovered among family papers in 1969, the judge reflected on the case years after the events had concluded. "I have often wondered," he wrote, "whether I should have acted more decisively when Miller first brought his suspicions to me. Perhaps if I had granted the warrant sooner or insisted on accompanying him with a larger party, the outcome might have been different. Yet even now I cannot imagine the horrors that were taking place in that seemingly ordinary establishment. It is a burden I shall carry to my grave, knowing that I might have prevented at least some of the suffering had I been less cautious or more perceptive." As for Martha Langley and Silas Thornton, their remains were buried in unmarked graves in the Potter's Field outside Shelbyville, the location recorded only in county documents that were later lost during a courthouse renovation in 1962. like the travelers they preyed upon, they too have disappeared into history, remembered only through the horror of their deeds. The legacy of the Widow's Inn extends beyond its immediate victims. It represents a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of travelers in an era before instant communication and reliable law enforcement. It reminds us that evil can wear a welcoming face, and that danger sometimes waits where comfort is promised. Perhaps most disturbingly, it suggests that under certain circumstances, humans are capable of viewing other humans not as people, but as resources to be exploited, a capacity for detachment that may lie dormant in more of us than we care to acknowledge. In the years following the case, several families across Tennessee, Kentucky, and neighboring states finally received answers about loved ones who had vanished while traveling through the region. Items recovered from the trunks in the underground chambers were cataloged and, where possible, returned to surviving relatives. For some, these items, a pocket watch, a wedding ring, a monogrammed handkerchief, represented the only tangible connection to someone who had disappeared decades earlier. The psychological study of Martha Langley continues to this day, with modern forensic psychologists revisiting the case in light of contemporary understanding of serial killers and their motivations. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers, in her 1968 analysis, suggested that Langley represented an unusual case of a female predator who did not conform to typical patterns. Unlike most female killers who tend to target family members or those in their care, Dr. Chambers wrote, Langley selected strangers as her victims. This represents a rare instance of a woman engaging in predatory behavior more commonly associated with male offenders. Some say that even now, on cold winter nights when the wind blows from the east, those driving the highway near where the inn once stood sometimes report a strange sensation, a momentary urge to pull over and rest, accompanied by what they describe as the distant smell of cooking and the sound of a woman's voice, calling them to stop and stay a while. But perhaps it's just the wind through the trees and the power of a story that refuses to die. In a final ironic twist to the tale, a developer attempted to build a roadside motel near the original site in 1965, apparently unaware of the location's history. Local opposition was immediate and vehement. Construction was abandoned after repeated vandalism of the site, with one partially completed structure mysteriously burning to the ground. The land has remained undeveloped since, a silent testament to a community's determination that some places should remain undisturbed, some histories uncommemorated. For those who study the darker chapters of American history, the case of the Widow's Inn stands as a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life, extraordinary evil can take root and flourish when circumstances permit. It reminds us that the monsters of legend have their counterparts in reality, and that the most frightening predators may be those who welcome us with open arms and the promise of shelter from the storm.